Somewhere in a cave above the Dead Sea, 11 copies of a single forbidden book were buried for 2,000 years, and almost nobody who reads the Bible today has ever heard its name. That number alone should stop you. 11 manuscripts. Not one, not two, but 11 separate copies of a text that never made it into the Old Testament or the New Testament, hidden away by a community that clearly believed it mattered more than almost anything else they owned. That book is the Book of Enoch, and when researchers recently ran its contents through Grok, the artificial intelligence system built by Elon Musk's XAI, what came back was not a simple summary. It was a set of connections so precise, so specific, that people who have spent their entire lives in church pews found themselves asking why no one had ever shown them this before. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the Book of Enoch actually is. It is an ancient Jewish religious text attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, a man the book of Genesis mentions in barely a handful of verses before saying, almost in passing, that he walked with God and then was not, because God took him. That is all the canonical Bible tells you. But the text that bears his name tells you an enormous amount more. Scholars generally place its composition somewhere between 300 and 100 BCE, though many believe certain sections, particularly the astronomical material, are considerably older than that. Across its pages, Enoch is taken on a tour through the heavens. He speaks with angels, both loyal and rebellious. He receives visions that stretch from the earliest days of creation to the final judgment of the world. It is, by any honest measure, one of the most ambitious religious documents to survive from the ancient world. And yet, for most of Western Christianity, it simply does not exist. It was excluded from the Hebrew Bible when Jewish religious authorities finalized their canon in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. It never made it into the official canon that Western Christian councils, including the Council of Carthage in 397 CE, eventually settled on. For well over 1,000 years, the complete text was essentially lost to European readers. It survived in exactly one place on earth, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which preserved the entire book as part of its official scripture, written in the ancient liturgical language of Guizi. That unbroken chain of preservation, carried forward by Ethiopian scribes for centuries while the rest of Christendom forgot the book existed, is the only reason we can read it in full today. It took a Scottish explorer named James Bruce, who brought copies back from Ethiopia in 1773, to finally give Europe its first real look at a text its own churches had abandoned more than a millennium earlier. Here is the detail that changes everything. The Book of Enoch is not some obscure curiosity floating on the margins of religious history. It is directly quoted in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude cites it almost word for word, attributing a prophecy explicitly to Enoch himself. Many scholars believe its influence runs far deeper than that single quotation suggests, shaping the theological imagination of the New Testament writers in ways modern readers rarely appreciate. It is almost certain that Jesus and his earliest followers knew this text well. It was circulating in their world, read in their communities, woven into the religious vocabulary of their generation. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If this book shaped the minds of the people who wrote the New Testament, why was it cut out of the Bible that eventually reached the rest of us? That unanswered question is exactly what pushed researchers toward an unusual experiment. Take the oldest surviving witness to this tradition and hand it to a machine that carries no doctrinal loyalty, no denominational stake in the outcome, and see what patterns rise to the surface when nothing is protecting the reader from what the text actually says. Grok, launched by XAI in late 2023, has developed a reputation for engaging with unconventional territory more directly than some of its competitors. Functionally, it does what large language models do. It processes enormous volumes of text, identifies recurring themes, compares literary structures across traditions, and explains dense theological material in accessible language. None of this is entirely new. Computational analysis has been applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, and the New Testament for years by academic researchers. What changed with a conversational system like Grok is access. Ordinary people, not just scholars with journal subscriptions and reading knowledge of Aramaic, can now ask layered questions about an ancient text and receive substantive answers within seconds. When people began doing exactly that with the Book of Enoch, the results were more than a simple summary. Grok surfaced structural patterns and thematic connections that had largely stayed buried inside academic papers few outside a small circle of specialists ever read. It traced links between Enoch and other ancient traditions, from Mesopotamian mythology to the manuscripts found at Qumran, in ways that felt genuinely illuminating rather than superficial. It is worth being precise here, because precision is where this story earns its credibility. Grok was not manufacturing supernatural claims. It was identifying patterns already present in the text and expressing them clearly. But when the source material is this dense, this old, and this deliberately sidelined by mainstream religious institutions, even a careful reading produces conclusions that feel startling. The first major section Grok focused on is the part scholars call the Book of the Watchers, spanning the opening 36 chapters. This is not a minor subplot tucked into the margins. It is the foundation on which the entire text is built. It introduces a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers, originally assigned to observe humanity from a distance, who instead chose to descend to Earth, take human wives, and father a race of hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. Grok treated this narrative as the interpretive key to the whole book, and the reasoning holds up. This story directly expands a handful of cryptic verses in Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God take human wives and produce giants upon the earth, verses that have puzzled readers for more than 2,000 years precisely because Genesis offers no explanation and moves on within a paragraph. Enoch goes much further than Genesis ever dares to. It names the Watchers individually. It identifies their leader as Semjaza. And it details the forbidden knowledge these beings supposedly handed down to humanity: metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery, the reading of the stars. In Enoch's telling, civilization's most dangerous skills did not develop gradually through human ingenuity. They were delivered across a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The analysis then drew out a comparison that scholars have discussed for decades, but that rarely reaches a general audience with any clarity. The Watcher narrative closely mirrors Mesopotamian traditions surrounding the Apkallu, semi-divine beings in Sumerian and Babylonian mythology said to have descended from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The overlap between these two traditions is close enough that some researchers believe both may trace back to an even older shared source, a story so ancient it predates the very cultures that first wrote it down. Then there are the Nephilim themselves. Enoch describes them as giants who consumed everything humanity produced, turned on the people around them, and eventually turned on one another. When they died, the text claims their disembodied spirits remained on the earth as the evil forces that continue to torment humanity to this day. In effect, the Book of Enoch is offering an origin story for demons, something the canonical Bible mentions only in passing and never fully explains. The deeper the analysis went, the more specific the text became. Beyond Semjaza, Enoch names roughly 200 Watchers who descended together on Mount Hermon, several of them assigned distinct roles. Azazel, Armoros, Barakel, Kokabel, and others each receive their own mention. Azazel draws particular attention and particular blame. The text credits him with teaching humanity how to forge swords, shields, and armor, essentially the technology of war, along with the arts of adornment through metalwork and jewelry, which the text frames as a corruption in its own right. Divine judgment falls hardest on Azazel. He is bound and cast into darkness, left to await final punishment at the end of days. Grok drew a direct line from this figure to Leviticus chapter 16, where the ancient scapegoat ritual sends one goat into the wilderness for Azazel, a phrase most Bible readers have encountered without ever having it properly explained. Enoch supplies the missing context. The goat carries the sins unleashed by forbidden knowledge back to the very being who first taught it, the bound one, imprisoned in darkness. The analysis then turned toward the sky, and this may be the most underappreciated section of the entire book. Chapters 72 through 82, known as the Book of the Luminaries, form one of the oldest layers of the text. Fragments of this section turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls dating to roughly 200 BCE. It tracks the movements of the sun, moon, and stars in remarkable detail, laying out a 364-day solar calendar built on 4 seasons of 91 days each, distinct from the lunar calendar used in later Jewish practice but matching calendar systems found in other scrolls tied to the Essene community at Qumran. That overlap has led some scholars to argue for a direct link between the community behind the scrolls and the tradition that produced Enoch. The astronomy is not accurate by modern standards, and any honest analysis says so plainly, but it reflects a genuinely sophisticated observational system built on patient, sustained tracking of the night sky across years, describing the sun rising and setting through 6 gates on the horizon, a real phenomenon tied to the seasonal shifting of sunrise and sunset points. Chapters 83 through 90 contain what scholars call the dream visions, and here the text begins behaving less like scripture and more like a coded chronicle of history. Enoch describes a terrifying preview of a coming flood, followed by a long allegorical retelling of history known as the animal apocalypse, in which the major figures of biblical history appear as animals. Adam and Eve as white bulls, the Israelites as sheep, their oppressors as predatory beasts. Grok's reading of this section leaned on a concept historians call vaticinium ex eventu, meaning prophecy written after the events it claims to predict. The analysis flagged that parts of the animal apocalypse are specific enough about real moments in Israelite history that they appear to have been composed with knowledge of those events already in hand. This is not a fringe accusation, it is a standard scholarly observation, and it is precisely why scholars generally date the animal apocalypse to the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BCE, since its coded imagery tracks the Jewish revolt against Seleucid rule closely enough to anchor the dating of the whole section. But the vision does not stop at known history. It pushes forward into a final battle, the defeat of evil, and a world remade in peace, an end-time sequence that shares clear structural similarities with the Book of Revelation, raising a genuine question about whether the author of Revelation drew directly from the Enochic tradition when composing the most famous apocalypse in Western literature. Then comes the part of the analysis that made people sit up, because this is where an obscure ancient book collides directly with the central figure of Western civilization. Chapters 46 through 48 of Enoch describe a heavenly figure called the Son of Man, a being who existed before creation, who sits beside God, and who will judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous at the end of days. That phrase carries enormous weight, because Son of Man is the title Jesus applies to himself more than any other in the entire New Testament. Appearing roughly 80 times across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Mark's Gospel especially, Jesus uses the phrase in contexts of cosmic authority and final judgment, contexts that align strikingly with Enoch's version of the figure. Grok's comparison flagged the specific traits Enoch assigns to this Son of Man: existence before creation, divine authority, the role of final judge, association with light and wisdom. This is not a vague thematic resemblance. It is a point-by-point correspondence close enough that scholars have argued over its implications since at least the 19th century. Some believe Jesus deliberately invoked the Enochic title to signal exactly what kind of figure he claimed to be. Others see the influence as more diffuse, absorbed through the broader religious culture of the time. Either way, this connection is not a new theory produced by an AI. It has been part of academic theology for well over a century. It simply remains invisible to most churchgoers because the book that defines the title never made it into the Western Bible. A genuine wrinkle surfaced when this connection was examined more closely. The section containing the Son of Man material, known to scholars as the Book of Parables, is conspicuously missing from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other major section of Enoch turned up at Qumran in some form. This one did not. Scholars take that absence seriously, since it suggests the parables may have developed later, or within a different community than the rest of the book. That absence does not undo the connection to Jesus, since the parables were clearly circulating before the end of the 1st century regardless of what Qumran happened to preserve. But it is exactly the kind of nuance that separates careful scholarship from a tidy talking point, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. So why was a book this influential left out of the Bible so many people grew up with? The honest answer is layered rather than simple, and it begins with a correction. The Book of Enoch was never officially part of a single universal Bible to begin with. It was excluded from different canons at different times for different reasons, less a single dramatic verdict than a slow, quiet drift out of circulation. The rabbinic authorities who finalized the Hebrew Bible may have left it out partly because its watcher's narrative and elaborate angelology read as dangerous during a period when Jewish religious identity was under enormous strain following the destruction of the Second Temple. On the Christian side, the canon took shape gradually through regional decisions, and by the time those decisions were made, Enoch's vivid fallen angel imagery and sprawling cosmology may simply have proven difficult to fit inside the theological structure the early church was building. What stands as genuinely remarkable is the exception. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never dropped the book, because it stood entirely outside the Roman process that defined the Western canon. Whether Enoch was actively removed or simply never included depends on which tradition you consult, and that is a quiet but profound reminder that the Bible was never one fixed, universally agreed object. It was, and still is, a set of overlapping decisions made by different communities across different centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls settle at least one question beyond dispute. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran and studied in depth by the scholar Józef Milik in the early 1950s. The material covers roughly 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch itself, spread across a much larger number of individual fragments dated to between roughly 200 and 100 BCE, along with several additional manuscripts of a related text called the Book of Giants. That makes Enoch one of the best represented non-canonical texts recovered at Qumran, with more surviving manuscript witnesses than several books that did make it into the Old Testament. This is documented archaeology, not speculation, and the physical evidence remains available through the Israel Antiquities Authority's digitized scroll archive. Before this story gets carried away with itself, it is worth being honest about where the real scholarship stands and where a machine like Grok hits its limits. Academics take this book far more seriously than popular media often suggests. Scholars such as James VanderKam and George Nickelsburg, who authored the standard academic commentary on First Enoch in the respected Hermenia series, spent entire careers establishing its theological depth and historical weight. Gabriele Boccaccini of the University of Michigan founded the Enoch Seminar in the early 2000s, an international research group devoted specifically to Enochic Judaism and its influence on both early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, and it continues convening specialists from around the world. This is mainstream, peer-reviewed scholarship, not fringe speculation, and the live academic debate has never been about whether the Enochic tradition influenced early Christianity. It is about how strong and how direct that influence actually was. Grok itself is a language model. It identifies patterns in text and draws connections based on its training data. It cannot verify historical events, confirm anything supernatural, or determine whether what Enoch describes actually happened. Some claims circulating online have suggested the AI proved the book historically accurate or confirmed the existence of the Nephilim. That is simply a misreading of what the tool does. There is also the translation problem to consider. Enoch survives in Aramaic and Hebrew fragments and a complete GUEZ text, and every English rendering, including R.H. Charles's influential 1917 translation and the later version by E. Isaac included in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha collection, involves interpretive choices that shape how the material reads. What remains, once all of that caution is accounted for, is a real, ancient, historically significant text, kept alive for 2,000 years by the devotion of the Ethiopian Church, excluded from most Western Bibles, and confirmed as genuinely old by the physical evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Running it through an AI did not uncover anything supernatural. What it did was take patterns scholars have quietly studied for generations, the Son of Man title, the Watcher's narrative, the fallen angel roster, the ancient astronomy, the judgment theology, and make them accessible to anyone with a phone and a few minutes of curiosity.